there's so much to be annoyed about. Well, there's so much for me to be annoyed about. I was initially triggered by Harry and Meghan being the royals. This latest thing. There's two things. There's a report out today about toxic masculinity in the Met, the Metropolitan Police. No one denies the failings and the inadequacies of the Met, but it's all, apparently the Met is full of misogyny and racism and homophobia, and that's being blamed on toxic masculinity. The very idea that masculinity is toxic is an existential threat to the species, really. You know, the masculines are 49% of the species, as I understand it. I think it's about 51% of us are women. But you know, we're half the species, and if the masculine half is toxic, then, well, good luck, everybody. And of course, masculinity is not toxic. But Harry and Meghan, in their continuing crusade to remain at the centre of everyone's attention, have latched onto toxic masculinity also. And I despair. You know, Harry's a boy, or he was the last time he was checked by anyone with a biological background, as I understand it, and he's the father. There's boys in his family, and he's a brother, and he's got a dad, but nonetheless he's latched on to this idea about toxic masculinity. And I have to say, I was watching GB News at one point, just roaming around in that undergrowth, and I chanced upon Davinia Taylor, who was on the paper review. She was part of that early lineup of Hollyoaks, I think. She's an actress, and then that wasn't what she was doing for a long time, and she's resurfaced. I've had her on my show, actually, on GB News. She's now a self-described biohacker. She's become very passionate and very well informed about health, nutrition, and the absolute central impact to well-being of the things we put inside our bodies. So that's her thing. But she was on taking part in the paper review, and she's a mum of boys, and she spoke out in straightforward celebration of her boys. I was cheering at the camera. She was talking about how her life is all about rugby kit and football kit and the laundry thereof, and also how footballs get kicked around in her kitchen and things get broken and there's fighting and scuffling and all the rest of it, and she loves it because it's boys and that's her world. She's got a husband and I think she's the only woman in her house, in her immediate household, and she loves living in that world. And she was speaking up, and she said something which I thought was particularly I just identified with it 100%. She said that boys are simple and loving, that they're less complicated than girls in her experience. And I've got two boys, and my eldest is my daughter, so I've got three, one girl, two boys, and I mean, I think everyone's relatively easy to understand, really, if you just pay attention. But I would certainly concur with the description of boys as being simple, straightforward and loving. We've got the usual stuff going on in here. My boys sometimes are rolling about on the floor, fighting with each other, and sometimes you can't quite tell just how good-hearted it is, but nonetheless there's rough and tumble goes on. But that's been my experience of boys, you know, this idea of them having a simple and loving approach to life. That's right. So I was cheering at the screen, and it was like a jolt of antiseptic for the poisonous nonsense from elsewhere, including Harry and Meghan, about masculinity being toxic. There is no way we can make room for that. It's absolute nonsense. Most of the problems in the world at the moment are there's not enough masculinity. That's really the problem. You know, so many boys now are being encouraged to think that their very nature, their masculinity, is somehow wrong from the start, and that as many have internalised that as have is a huge part of the problem. You know, and boys are struggling. It's well reported that white working class boys in Britain do worst of all at school, and their life chances, by any metric, are the least promising compared to any other group. And that is surely an egregious wrong that we've allowed that to happen, and that in that context masculinity itself is being described as toxic. Well, the solution to the problem is to realise the obvious, which is that masculinity is not toxic. We need masculinity. But that was only the start of it, honestly. I went from that into yet more reporting of Partygate and Cakegate, because Boris Johnson apparently has submitted his defence. He's written it out. He's done his homework and written out his excuse for whatever happened. And I mean, I couldn't care less. I don't care if they were taking cake or coke in Westminster during lockdown. The problem was that we're being invited to overlook, encouraged to overlook, is that they weren't frightened. The intention was to terrify the general population out of a year's growth, frighten the pants off everyone. We know that. It's there in the testimony that we've got from Matt Hancock's WhatsApp conversations. But they weren't frightened. They knew there was nothing to be frightened of, and they were laughing up their sleeves about what a bunch of mugs they had made of us. So it's not about whether somebody looked at a cake. It's not about whether somebody was drinking or not. It's the fact that while they tried to terrify the population, they knew there was nothing to be frightened of. So, just do me a favour and stop with that nonsense. If you're going to focus on what happened during lockdown, focus on what happened during lockdown. The damage to the economy, the damage to people's health and well-being, the uncounted deaths. Let's talk about that, and let's not get preoccupied with this nonsense about who did or didn't attend a party. What else? It's 20 years since Iraq, right? What an anniversary that is. How much has changed in the world since George Bush and Tony Blair decided that come hell or high water they were going into Iraq to go after Saddam Hussein. 20 years later, and look where we are. And we know now that it was based on lies. It was an unlawful war. There was that September dossier, the sexed up dossier, Alistair Campbell's involvement in all of that as well. That we were tricked. We were lied to and tricked into thinking that Saddam Hussein was in a position at 45 minutes' notice to bring weapons of mass destruction down upon our heads. He never could. He didn't have any kind of weapons, far less weapons of mass destruction by the time they went in after him. And it was all lies and propaganda. According to George Galloway, 1 million people, 1 million Iraqis were dead before the war on account of the sanctions. And then, as a result of the war and its aftermath, who knows? Millions more dead. Very difficult to count given the circumstances. And despite all of that, those characters who perpetrated that unlawful war are still out and about. And in the case of Blair, Tony Blair, he's spent the last God knows how long now enriching himself with millions by courting despots and spending his time offering whatever advice it is that he offers to corrupt regimes all over the world. Some of the darkest corners of the planet, he's been in there filling his pockets. And now he's still out there among us, pushing medical products of one sort or another at us, pushing digital IDs. And I can well understand why somebody like Tony Blair wants digital IDs foisted upon everyone, presumably because he lives in perpetual fear of the very existence of free, educated, informed, confident civilians, some of whom might finally one day ask questions about what he was up to 20 years ago. So there's that. Climate crisis. My God, climate crisis. Will it ever end? I go whenever that comes up, or whenever anything comes up that really upsets me, I always go to the Guardian newspaper. I go there because I think if I'm going to, if you're going to keep a bear, keep a grizzly. If I go in search of the epicenter of bollocks, written by the high priests of shite, I go to the Guardian. And I quote, "Scientists have delivered a final warning on the climate crisis as rising greenhouse gas emissions push the world to the brink of irrevocable damage that only swift and drastic action can avert. Extreme weather caused by climate breakdown has led to increased deaths from intensifying heat waves in all regions, millions of lives and homes destroyed in droughts and floods, millions of people facing hunger and increasingly irreversible losses in vital ecosystems." Honestly, the situation we're in part, the situation that we are in is infected, corrupted, challenged to a dangerous degree by the extent to which the last few years have given people an alarming tolerance for fear. But the propaganda and the nudging and the fear that's been heaped upon us for the last 3 years means that too many people out there are like £1,000 a day coke addicts. They can take a lot of fear and remain standing. Fear in small doses, triggers adrenaline in small doses, and that's all that's required. But because so much fear has been pushed our way day after day for a sustained period of time, fear isn't working in the way it's supposed to anymore. People are becoming immune to the fear, whether they're noticing or not. And so, as a consequence, we're being prescribed more and more of the fear to try and get to that original effect that the fear was having. And in any event, more and more people who didn't take the fear drug in the first place, who carefully avoided the fear, have spotted and are desperately aware of the real things to be worried about, which is to say, bread and butter stuff like the damage to the economy, the attacks on farming and on farmers by those corrupt governments that want to take control of the land and take control of the food supply, the orchestrated energy crisis, the proxy war in Ukraine. And, you know, this week in particular, or over the last week to 10 days, many more people have noticed that something really fishy is going on with the banks. People are paying attention to that. People are increasingly wanting their money out. There's general advice out there to not leave more than £10,000 of savings in any bank account. Imagine. Remember when banks, we were all told that, you did it as a kid, put your money in the bank, any £5 here and £10 there, put it in your savings account, it'll be safe as houses and it'll grow. Remember that? People aren't accepting that anymore. That medicine has gone past its sell-by date. And, people are buying gold, people are buying silver, people are doing things to get their money out of the banks as safely as possible. And so all of it, right? This is a problem for the powers that be, because the fear isn't working. The pandemic that ran out of steam a while ago, the war in Ukraine. I mean, God bless and God help the poor people of Ukraine, but the devastation that has been wrought, that has been brought down upon their heads. I mean, God help those poor people. But questions are now being asked by more and more people about the background to that war, and most pertinently of all, just when it might be brought to an end and when peace might be restored. And so, what do they roll out? What do the powers that be roll out? As if on cue, the end of the world is nigh. That's it. Remember the sandwich boards that you see photographs of, people wandering about the streets saying the end of the world is nigh? This is not a new tactic. But here we go again. The end of the world is nigh. I mean, come on. But sure enough, right on cue, the United Nations has jabbed onto stage from the wings the IPCC to sing the song of climate crisis, to make us look the other way again. Don't look at what the politicians have really been up to. Don't look at the devastation to your economies. Don't look at the harm to everyone's health and well-being. Don't look, for God's sake, at what we've done to the currencies of the world. Don't look at the way the banks are now leaning like the Tower of Pisa and could fall over at any point. And that's orchestrated as well, but don't get me started on that. Climate, let's say it once and say it proud. The climate crisis, there is no climate crisis, right? The climate is changing. The climate's supposed to change. The climate's been changing for as long as there's been a climate on planet Earth, which is hundreds of millions of years, billions of years there's been a climate of one sort or another. And you've only got to look back 100, 150 years to see the pattern of climate alarmism. From the 1880s to the 1940s, scientists and others were aware of the planet warming up. There were droughts, there was extreme weather, right? From the 1880s to the 1940s. But by the 1940s, the Earth, they noticed, was cooling down again. Right? It was cooling. And by the 1960s, it seemed to be cooling so much that scientists and the media started the next panic, which was about the end of the world due to cold. And I'm old enough to remember mock-up newspaper front pages of icebergs on the Thames floating past the Palace of Westminster and polar bears roaming London. The fear-mongering that was predicted then through the 60s and into the 70s. There were proposals in the 70s to cover Antarctica with soot. Literally, to ice it, like with icing sugar, but black. Soot, to make it melt. Right? The proposal was they could make the ice of Antarctica melt. And there were proposals by some means or other to pump cold water from the Arctic into the Pacific to sort of spread out the coldness and warm it up a bit. Madness. And then, so cold, we're all going to die of cold, end of the world. Ice age. And then in the 1980s, what do they notice? The planet's warming up again. And cue Al Gore and the rest of them, all the way up to St. Greta of Thunberg. Now those with an eye to making money, who are always at the back of everything, they want humans to accept all of the blame for this. Anthropogenic global warming, they call it. And so they've come up with what we've got, Agenda 2030, net zero, which is all of it together dangerous, suicidal nonsense that will mean death for millions. 97% of scientists agree that human beings are to blame for climate change. You know that one. Headlines around the world, again and again and again, as though that's the settled science. That's the science says. Well, let me tell you how that was achieved. 11,944 papers, scientific papers, were gathered together, and a team of researchers were given the task of reading not the papers, not reading from first page to last page, reading the abstracts, which is the couple of paragraphs on the front cover, the synopsis that tells you what the paper's going to be about. Okay, so the team of researchers read the abstracts from 11,944 papers. We don't know what qualifications those researchers had for the job. They're never named. But anyway, they basically split the 11,944 papers into 4 piles, right? Pile number 1 was where they concluded from the abstract, right, just from the abstract, that the authors endorsed the idea of humans being to blame for global warming. Okay, there were 3,896 of those. There were 7,930 papers in the pile where the readers had concluded that the authors had taken no position whatsoever, either way, on whether humans were to blame for global warming. 78 papers went in the pile where humans being to blame was rejected out of hand, and there were 40 in the pile where the authors seemed to be uncertain about humans being to blame for global warming. So, based on those 4 piles, 32% of the papers blamed humans for global warming. So that's not a scary headline, is it? That's not a scary number. So what did they do? They put in the bin the 7,930 papers where the authors had taken no position one way or the other on whether humans were to blame. They just went in the bin. It was the clumsiest sleight of hand you ever did see. It was all based on taking the majority of the papers, 7,930, that didn't fit the profile and putting them in the bin to get the number up to 97%. Now, millions of people are struggling right now for all sorts of reasons to do with the incompetence or the biblical wickedness of governments and their little wizards. Unknown numbers of people are dying because of consequences that have been inflicted by politicians and world leaders and the rest. But people are waking up. People are waking up to the lies of the last 3 years. It's all coming home to roost. It's all coming out. More and more people are understanding and questioning more and more. So, it's at a time like this that you have to ask, not what is being said about the climate crisis, it's when it's being said. Once again, when all else fails, when too many people are beginning to ask uncomfortable questions for which the politicians and the rest have no convincing answers, what do? They sing the song of the world is coming to an end. Don't listen to it. It's palpable nonsense. Pay attention to what's really going on, as usual.